I would like to introduce our speakers for the next panel. Vivian Walker, Executive Director of the United States Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy at the Department of State, and an expert and advisor of the capacity building project that supports Ukraine's public and cultural diplomacy, which is implemented by the American councils with support of the US Embassy here in Kyiv. Welcome, Vivian, back to Kyiv. And acting director of the Department of Public Diplomacy and Communications, Iryna Borovets, joining us from the Foreign Ministry of Ukraine. Thank you for coming, and I regret to inform that the First Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Emina Japarova, felt unwell today, so she had to excuse herself, and she sends her best wishes and kind regards to everyone in the audience. So thank you for joining. Maybe in some initial reflections on the discussions of the previous two panels and presentations. I know, Ira, that you've joined just now, so you probably didn't have a chance to listen to those, but Vivian, perhaps, yeah, you wanted to share your initial feedback or reflections on the key topics of our today's discussion, particularly the Ukraine's place in the world, Ukraine's importance to the world, and what relevance can Ukraine bring to the international table. And you know, our previous speakers have expressed a lot of very important, I think, messages about that. So the floor is yours. Please comment.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. It's a pleasure to be back in Kyiv after almost 2 years. And I share the sentiments of the author of that article that you referred to earlier about Kyiv and about Ukraine. It's an extraordinary place, and I am delighted to be back. I'm also delighted to be a part of this very important conversation about Ukraine and culture and the use of cultural diplomacy to further Ukraine's future in the global media space, the global information space. I found both of our principal speakers today, Mr. Call and then our more recent speaker, to provide a really useful framework for us to have this discussion. I think Call's focus on reputational security is absolutely true. And it's really a fresh way to think about the relationship between culture and national security. As a longtime public diplomacy officer, foreign service officer for the Department of State, and I served as a public diplomacy officer, I found myself often battling the notion that cultural diplomacy was somehow secondary to everything else. That short-term advocacy, focusing on getting out the message about a country's policies, its actions, its behaviors, was all that needed to be done in order to explain a country's position, in order to frame its place in the global space. And in fact, as Call has demonstrated and other speakers have indicated, culture is essential to national security because culture and the projection of national culture enables the creation of conditions for understanding and empathy. When you talk about the definition of public diplomacy is, yes, in the first instance, to inform through short-term advocacy. But in the second instance, the role of public diplomacy is to influence, to shape attitudes and perceptions about the country, about its interests, about its objectives. Merely sharing information, press releases, talking points, speeches, is informing, but not necessarily influencing. And it is the investment in cultural outreach, cultural diplomacy, that creates the potential for influence, that provides context for external audiences to appreciate the challenges, the history that frame the way a country behaves in the global information space. So, to summarize, I think that focus on that, understanding the relationship between culture and reputation and national security is key. To say a little bit about your question about Ukraine and its place in the global order. To borrow from our previous speaker, I think, as you know, we are focused on geostrategic competition. Our previous speaker mentioned the competition with China, but there are other competitors out there. And a number of those competitors use, shall we say, use strategies of malign influence, use their sort of authoritarian approach to misinform, disinform, deliberately destabilize. We can think of Russia, but Russia is certainly not the only one. And in this way, Ukraine is indirectly drawn into the whole geostrategic competition through its relationship with Russia. And in fact, when people, when the rest of the world thinks about Ukraine, it more or less thinks about Ukraine through the lens of its relationship with Russia, and specifically Russia's aggression. There are other associations with Ukraine, of course, and our previous speakers referred to some of them, Chernobyl, Holodomor. But primarily, if people think about Ukraine today, they think about it in terms of Russia. Now, there are two streams of perception, I think, generally speaking. One is that Ukraine is a victim of Russian aggression. But there also, I think, is a strong perception out there of Ukraine as the courageous underdog, as a country and a people that is standing up to aggression. Now, both these perceptual streams are important and actually, in a sense, good for Ukraine. Because I don't think, in general, people approve of Russia's behavior toward Ukraine, so that status of victimhood contributes to a certain amount of sympathy, perhaps, for Ukraine. But I think we can also agree that focusing on the victimhood status will not advance Ukraine and create the opportunity to change perceptions about Ukraine. And I think rather it's focusing on Ukraine and using culture to help external audiences focus on Ukraine as that as a resilient actor standing up to aggression. And here is where it gets tricky, and certainly Cole alluded to this. Resilience is not merely telling the story about what has happened to Ukraine at the hands of Russia. Resilience is acknowledging that there are a number of challenges that Ukraine faces right now. Certainly Russia is one of them, but challenges associated with corruption, with the judiciary, with democratization efforts. And here I think there is an opportunity for Ukraine to talk about those challenges, to acknowledge them, and talk about what is being done to address them. Because in that way, can play upon the existing, I think, sympathy for Ukraine and existing empathy by demonstrating that these problems exist and these are the steps that we've taken to address them. And in that way, you not only, I think, assure greater empathy, but you build credibility. Because not to acknowledge these challenges hurts Ukraine. To acknowledge them in a constructive way, I think, can only help Ukraine.
Thank you very much, Vivian, for reinforcing that message about the need to acknowledge difficult topics and work our way around those instead of just passing by and ignoring them. I think that's really important. Thank you for this overview. And we've spoken a lot about kind of geostrategic constellations, competitions, and geopolitical order of today's world. I think it's time to then sort of narrow it down to the very specific policy messages and policy objectives that Ukraine has formulated for itself to respond to these global challenges and global order. Quite recently, Ukraine adopted its new foreign policy strategy. So I wanted to ask Iryna about about the priorities and main objectives set out in that strategy, what they are, and how cultural and public diplomacy can respond directly to strengthening those and fulfilling those objectives.
Is it on?
I think it should be on, yes. Can we turn the second microphone on?
Is it on?
Можна вімкнути другий мікрофон?
Is it good? Oh, yeah, yes. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I would probably first refer to what Vivian has been said recently about the status of victim or victimhood status, and this is actually correlating with the new foreign policy strategy. This is actually something, this victimhood status, is something that we now changing at the MFA or at the level of the state. Ukraine is not a victim or doesn't want to be represented as a victim, solely as a victim of Russian aggression or malign Russian influence. We would rather present to the world our added value in different areas, and we think that actually these added values make us relevant and very promising partners in the future. Let me give you a couple of examples. For example, our foreign policies actually and strategy stipulates that Ukraine is a proactive regional player, that Ukraine is a contributor to a global problem solution. So we are not the source of the problem, we are those who offer the solutions to our partners. Ukraine is a country of economic and investment opportunities. We are an attractive IT hub, and we are, or Ukraine is a country of many more attractions. So this is, in simple words, all the priorities that set up in the strategy, and there are 6 strategic priorities stipulated in the strategy, and you can actually read them, starting from the countering the Russian aggression and so on, and public diplomacy is one of these 6 top priorities for the foreign policy of Ukraine. And let me give you just a couple of examples of how Ukraine represents itself as a proactive player, because I mentioned that, but let's be data-driven, yes, and we need some very down-to-earth examples of what Ukraine actually is doing right now. Let me start with probably the most important issue for our country and the world, the issue of security. Today, Ukraine strengthens its own security and the security of the region. For example, we are creating regional alliances and putting forward security initiatives to our partners. For example, Lublin Triangle, Association Trio, Quadriga, this is the partnership with Turkey on the level of the MFAs and the Ministry of Defenses. This is Crimean Platform, the recent international initiatives that we launched in August. All these formats are very practical formats where with our partners we can solve problems of regional and wider security to the European and wider region. Of course, it includes coping with Russian aggression, but this is something that Ukraine initiated and launched. So we are not just asking for help, we provide help and solution by ourselves. Then I would mention also that we are active international player who offers help to international partners in every sense. Let's remember the recent very successful evacuation from Gaza Strip or from Afghanistan, where Ukraine, one of the successful European nation who evacuated, who took over, I think, 650 citizens, not only Ukrainian, out of Kabul. Or our help to Greece and Turkey last summer during the wildfire there. So we are very active in international arena, and we are helping our partners. We create idea and offer solution to global problems, and Crimean platform that we launch is one of them. So this is the first real peaceful deoccupation format for the Crimea, for the Crimean Peninsula. Of course, after the inaugurational summit, we have a lot of job to do, and of course, MFA now, together with the entire system of Ukrainian institutions who are dealing with this, the occupation issues, are planning our next steps. But the beginning of the occupation actually set out. Then Ukraine creates new economic opportunities. Let's not forget that Ukraine is a global food security guarantor with our enormous potential in agricultural sector. So this role becomes even more important amid the growing global food need. So. What else? Our first digitalization. We are one of the probably most successful country who provides digitalization, and our IT sector is something that is very promising to cooperate with Ukraine. And finally, public and cultural diplomacy. Sorry for going beyond purely public diplomacy or cultural diplomacy issues, but I represent the MFA, so it's I think, absolutely okay. Our public diplomacy goal is spread the positive perception of Ukraine. This is the one of the priorities for the foreign policy strategy. This is the top priority for our strategy for public diplomacy that we adopted earlier this year, and it will be on for the next 5 years. Going on. This is something that now Ukraine and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs actually rise to the strategic level. So if a couple of years ago public diplomacy was one of the I don't know, many areas where we are trying to be active, now this is one of the 6 of the top priorities for foreign policy of Ukraine, and not only for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at the level, at the level of the state. I would say that the foreign policy strategy and the strategy for public diplomacy, these 2 strategies are in absolute synergy between themselves, because they, in different words, but they set out absolutely clear paths to the better image of Ukraine abroad through different tasks and steps that we need to do. Our 3 key goals that we are trying to achieve by these documents is, first of all, Ukraine should be more known abroad, and known in a positive way. Of course, that Ukraine should, the perception of Ukraine should reflect our European identity and our European aspirations as a full-fledged fledged member of the EU and NATO in the future. And the third goal is to be proactive in sharing or spreading our own positive narratives, not being a part of someone else's story, not being a part of negative narratives, Russian negative narratives, or not only debunking them, but provide our own stories about ourselves, in order to show that our country is very innovative, very dynamic, very attractive for tourism, investment, education, visiting, living, and so on. What else can I say? Maybe you can actually...
Sure. Thank you, Iryna. I mean, I feel that a lot of the messages that you have just shared or mentioned are indeed about proactivity rather than reactivity. And I think it's a great change of mindset in many people's minds, that we should not just react to bad stuff being thrown at us, but offering a genuine alternative, which is honest, which is positive, which is, we're not afraid to have our own voice in the world, and we're not afraid to talk about good stuff, but also about the challenges. And I think it's a really strong shift that is happening now with all the strategic documents that have been set in motion very recently. Having said that, Vivian, I remember our last year's conversation at this International Cultural Diplomacy Forum, in which you participated online, and you said that Ukraine has for too long been framed by Russia and having been reactive to Russia's efforts, policies, aggression, etc., etc. And you argued that it was sort of high time to shift that. With that, how can you characterize the United States public diplomacy strategies over the past decades? I mean, in the second half of the 20th century, particularly also in the post-9/11 world, has the US's public diplomacy been reactive, proactive, or both, or it changed depending on the geopolitical circumstances and the domestic policies that the US has experienced over the past decades? Because it's a long-standing function of the American state. I mean, public diplomacy is not as new as obviously in Ukraine. So how was it developing over years in terms of its pro or reactivity? Sorry for such a huge question, probably, but I'm really interested to hear that.
Well, it is an enormous question, but I will say that the first and simplest and actually truest answer is that it's always both, right? You are certainly when responding to crises or evolving situations, or trying to promote a particular set of policies or actions or defend those actions, it is very often reactive. You have to react to a situation, you have to stay current, you have to take ownership of the issue or the problem immediately in order to prepare the groundwork for future solutions. So in that sense, US government public diplomacy, but any government's public diplomacy is always going to have to be reactive in the moment, and to be able, but also be able to shift between reactive and proactive fairly quickly. So that is to say, you may begin by reacting to a problem, explaining what happened, justifying the action that was taken if necessary, but then shift the conversation to a proactive level to say, and here is how going forward we're going to address this issue. Or here is the mistake that we made and this is what we're going to change. Oh, and by the way, this is how our forward action fits into our values, how it fits into our overall strategic objectives, how it fits into our cooperative objectives. So I find public diplomacy is a constant sort of shifting between proactive and reactive, and one complements the other. So, I hope that answers your question, or do you want to probe a little more? Or
I wanted actually to probe a little more about on the very structure of the U.S. public diplomacy, and I have read the very recent report the Advisory Commission released on the state of play in the U.S. public diplomacy in terms of funding, in terms of its impact, in terms of its return on investment for the U.S. economy. I think few of us actually know what that huge function is in the U.S. Can you tell us a little bit more about what priorities are there for the United States public diplomacy in the world? Which areas receive least or most attention, and what do you see as sort of the biggest impact, tangible or intangible, that you can feed back to the policymakers and say, look, this really works?
No, that's a great question. And the report that Volodya is referring to is our annual report on the state of U.S. government public diplomacy, both in the Department of State, but also activities carried out by the U.S. Agency for Global Media, which is our public-funded international broadcasting service. And I commend to you the report. I wouldn't commend all 300 pages of it, but I do think that if you are interested in sort of the top lines of U.S. government public diplomacy and how it's funded, and where the funding concentrations lay, check out the executive summary. I think it'll be quite informative. But to answer your question, and I'm going to go back to that executive summary. There is one chart in that executive summary, and perhaps you can look it up now if you are so inclined, that lists all of the countries in which we have public diplomacy activities at all of our embassies overseas, and it rank orders them by the amount of money that is put to each country specifically for public diplomacy activities. And I think many of you would be surprised at the rank ordering. Number one is usually a conflict zone. Afghanistan, possibly Iraq. Pakistan has been up there as well. But then what do you see? Do you see Great Britain? No. Do you see Germany? No. Do you see Japan? No. Up there in that list is Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, the Republic of Georgia, and indeed Ukraine. In other words, where the U.S. government puts its public diplomacy monies corresponds almost directly to its national security priority plan, and we're still going off the plan of 2017. And among these national security priorities are transnational crime, countering violent extremism, dealing with economic inequities, and so forth. So actually, the use of public diplomacy monies focuses on addressing these fundamental security issues. This comes as a shock to people who associate public diplomacy with, apart from press releases, of course, and spokespersons and daily press briefs, with scholarships and hip hop and, I don't know, art exhibits, all of which are important aspects of American public diplomacy, but in terms of the use of public diplomacy as a tool of statecraft, as a tool of foreign policy, it is focused by the money, because in the end, that's where you get, you go by where the money goes. It goes to dealing with these issues that cut to the heart of American security and economic priorities. And I would say that it was ever thus. And that is not, again, to go back to what I was saying earlier, in my experience as a public diplomacy officer, having to fight for the relevance of cultural diplomacy, but rather an argument to sort of reconceptualize our attitude toward cultural diplomacy and see it as one of the enablers of national security. And how does it do that? Just as you were suggesting, use public diplomacy to create a context why the United States government, in my case, acts the way it does, what its priorities are, what it values, and then that helps your audiences to understand the actions that you take and maybe even perhaps to accept or at least tolerate them, if not wholeheartedly support them.
Thank you, Vivian. What you mentioned about sort of security being at the forefront of America's public diplomacy efforts also suggests to me that it's as much about advancing America's national interests, but also it is about shared challenges and shared security challenges, economic challenges, and political challenges, and that's something that we've been talking a lot about today. With that, I wanted to sort of to mirror that question to Iryna and to ask her to tell us a bit more about the Crimea platform and what, how public diplomacy, in your opinion, and cultural diplomacy can underpin this strategic objective of Ukraine's foreign policy, but also a shared challenge, because it's not a Ukraine's problem, it is a global problem. So how we can serve basically better to help with this longer-term objective of deoccupation of Crimea and also protection of human rights, and also raising awareness of the international community and keeping up the not letting this theme and this topic fade away.
Actually, your question is in line of what Vivian has been saying just right now about the public diplomacy going after the national security priorities. This is a case for Ukraine as well, and of course for the country who is in state of war with its neighbor. It's absolutely okay, and unless we have the neighborhood as we have, maybe this state of our affairs will be the same. But I would say that the national security issues are of utmost importance for Ukraine right now, and they are, and they will be, especially considering the ongoing Russian aggression and all the problems that actually are the consequences of this aggression. And maybe the Crimean Platform Initiative is the very good example of how public diplomacy could reinforce what the foreign policy or defense policy are doing right now in terms of the occupation. As you know, that the Crimean Platform is, without exaggeration, was a historic event, the summit of Crimean Platform. And the Ukrainian Institute and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, together with Ministry of Culture, tried to present the ambitious cultural program that actually gave an added value to the political event. And I think that we reinforce the political track of Crimean Platform that day by all those cultural projects that we presented to our guests. I must say that this soft power worked very well, because our cultural program at the Crimea Platform Summit was a success, the absolute success, because we saw how people literally dived in emotions, especially writing messages to Crimea or people from Crimea. There was a multimedia digital project, multimedia wall, yes, let's say, where you could write the message to anyone in Crimea, to Crimea Peninsula itself with any text, wishing whatever you want, and so on. And many more. There are other projects that were really very emotional, and they actually helped people to dive into the history and tradition of Crimea, and they understand that beside this geopolitical problem that Crimea or temporary occupation of Crimea represents, there is a human side of this story, that there are human lives that actually are affected by occupation. So we think that we actually deepen even the political effect by our cultural program. So actually, this is the very best example of how the cultural diplomacy actually could complement, reinforce, and even maybe be sometimes more effective in order to assure some political decision or an attitude of a certain group of people to what Ukraine is doing in order to deoccupy Crimea. And I would say that there is a room now, if we are already building our future plans together with the Ukrainian Institute on how can we further develop this track. I could see that our task for today is to think over how we could develop the deep cultural layer of the Crimean platform. And I think that we will need some brainstorming on this issue, or maybe you have already some ideas in Ukrainian Institute. So we are in MFA are ready to discuss it.
Thank you. I mean, you almost stole my comment that I wanted to share, that Crimean platform was advertised and was launched as a three-layered permanent initiative which functions on the governmental level, on parliamentary level, and on expert and civil society level. And I very much wanted to add a fourth layer to that, which is cultural layer, because this is something I strongly believe in, that we should not even think, that we should not only think about physical deoccupation, right, of Crimea, but we also should think about cultural deoccupation of Crimea. And through culture, it's sometimes much easier to debunk all those very toxic narratives and stereotypes and misconceptions imposed by Russia about the so-called Crimean people, about, you know, unifying everyone living in the peninsula and erasing differences between people and between ethnic communities and religious communities, and this narrative that Orysia referred to in this Chatham House report about Crimea has always been part of Russia, which is also a completely false statement, etc., etc. So, I mean, certainly the Ukrainian Institute is working on plans to enhance the Crimean platform with various cultural interventions in the civil society domain to do exactly that, to basically counter those narratives and offer a very sort of Ukraine-centric narrative of what Crimea is and what state Crimea is in today.
Just
sure.
Yeah, just a short reference that we can, together with the Ukrainian MFA and Ukrainian Institute, can actually think of how to involve Crimea into the international cultural discourse, not just to plan certain events in certain countries for certain targeted audiences, but how to actually take Crimea and bring it to the international cultural discourse in order to I don't know, to initiate the ongoing expert cultural discussion on the Crimean future even. I think that the Ukrainian Institute, given its reputation and possibilities and ties with so many cultural partners in the world, is able to do that. And of course, MFA is going to help with that.
Thank you very much, Ira. Vivian, back to you, and to my previous question about the structure of the U.S. public diplomacy. Having read again your report, I'm referencing again your report. I noticed that a third of your 2.2 billion budget that is directed towards public diplomacy in the States is going to educational and cultural programs. And that struck me, and it took me by surprise in a way, because in my kind of mental map, culture was a minor element in the US public diplomacy, and I was sort of proven false by that report. Can you elaborate a little bit more about what that actually means and what activities and interventions and objectives the US is pursuing through that 1/3 of its public diplomacy capacity?
Right, so these are programs managed by the Bureau of Education and Cultural Affairs. That involves more than 90 separate education, professional training, cultural program run by the Department of State. And these programs range from programs you have probably heard of or perhaps even participated in, like Fulbright, the Fulbright Scholarships or the Muskie Scholarships or the Humphrey Fellowships. They also extend to exporting aspects of American art, of American theater, culture, music. These programs support preservation of antiquities. There are legacy programs thanks to earmarks from our Congress that focuses on development of youth or empowering women in particular countries or regions. So these programs cover the full range of activities, and they are used to support overall U.S. foreign policy objectives. Now, it is very easy to see how a press conference or press release or a targeted speech or a dialogue can directly contribute to national security objectives. It's much harder to make the case that the Fulbright program, that the FLEX program, that they contribute to national security. So the challenge is not in convincing people of the need for these programs. The challenge persists in trying to make the direct connection between investment in these kinds of programs and an appreciable result. My military colleagues could point to an action taken and say, we recovered this many kilometers of territory, we achieved this many physical objectives, and that was a success. My colleagues in the realm of assistance at USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, for example, could say, well, we promoted, so many hospitals were built, so many bridges were constructed, so many people were introduced to a new healthcare regime. The problem with the investment, the 1/3 investment of education and cultural exchange is that we have to take the results to some degree on faith. You have to ultimately depend on the continued goodwill and interest of our legislators, of our leaders, in continuing in the investment of activities and programs that do ultimately contribute to national security through their ability to promote understanding, to provide context, as I said earlier, but to continue to keep the faith in the value of investment in these programs.
This is something that, you know, I think every country has been struggling with in terms of evaluation of their culture and public diplomacy and soft power initiatives, and proving that it's worth continuing to invest in these very intangible assets. But thanks for that message about good faith and about believing in power of that activity, despite you know, all the kind of intangible nature of what we're talking about today. Anyway, we can have questions from the audience, and of course we can have questions from the audience who are watching us online. Please think of anything that you want to ask to our speakers. Meanwhile, I will ask them to sort of yes, please, Iryna. Yeah.
A short question from my side, probably to Vivian, continuing what we asked Nicholas about. What is your perspective? How do you think, what are the key topics and themes and projects that Ukraine can be relevant for other countries and to United States specifically? Because as you heard, Nicholas was talking a lot about being relevant as a key point in contemporary cultural diplomacy activities.
No, that's a great question, and let me try to answer it. I think the danger, excuse me, I think the danger is that when we engage in, you know, demonstrating resilience and proving relevance, that we want to do it across the board at once to every possible audience, right? Because the need is so urgent. But I think the most important thing that before actually engaging in these activities is to sit back and think, what is most important? What are Ukraine's strategic priorities? What are the areas in particular where you want to reach out, where you want to be relevant, where you want to generate understanding? Now, these priorities might or might not correspond to your national security objectives. That's something for the decision that is made at the level of government. But you can't do it all at once and at the same time. So part of actually being effective is triage, is streamlining, is identifying what are the issues and topics particularly that we need support on. And then the next step is, who are your audiences? But that's not even the final step, right? Because once you think you understand who your audiences are for those particular objectives, you have to understand, what do they think? Audience perception, soft power, as Joseph Nye has told us, soft power is governed by not what we think as our government or our institution, what we think we value. It's how the rest of the world perceives those attributes. So before you get started on creating a program or generating a set of messages, not only do you need to know what specifically you want to say, who you want to reach, you need to know what they think and feel about those issues. Because if you are going to shape their behaviors or their perceptions, or at least make them a little more understanding, if not actively supportive, you have to understand first what they think about it. So, what I'm building here is a huge research project, right? But essentially, effective outreach, whether it's short-term advocacy, but more importantly, longer-term cultural outreach, is really dependent upon your ability to match your priorities and your interests with your audiences and understand what your audiences think about it. Once you have that understanding, that allows you a few things that are really important. First of all, it allows you to design programs, messaging, approaches that are going to be compatible with your audience's perceptions and interests. It's, you know, if you provide things in terms that they're going to understand or appreciate, they are much more likely then to shift behaviors and priorities. So it's a huge research project. And that can be a little bit frustrating I had these conversations with my bosses back in the day when I was a diplomat, where they want it now. and they want the message set ready right away. And when you go back and say, yeah, but first we need to understand who it is we need to reach and how we reach them, that is not always met with genuine support. So that is a case that continually needs to be made. But I hope that answers your question.
Can I ask a very quick follow-up question to that? You mentioned that the biggest investment of the United States public diplomacy goes to conflict zones and countries that engaged or involved in conflict. Some of those countries may not be that receptive to the American values that the U.S. public diplomacy tries to advance and promote. How does that correspond with your message about, listening to what the audience actually want to hear or need, with that kind of inherent conflict between mindsets of what America tries to advance and what the reception on the ground is in many places in the world?
I think that dynamic, that conflict between the projected values and the underlying interests, or the projected interests and underlying values, and how audiences may respond to or feel about those values, that conflict will never go away. That dynamic never goes away. You cannot, as a government, have an expectation that your interests and your policies are going to be met by universal approbation. It's simply not going to happen. And it's because people respond to the projection of your values with their own understanding of those same values. And I'll give you an example that I've used before, I think, where when the United States government would message on attempts to desecrate or in some way harm the image of Islam. Yeah, I know if you remember the Quran burnings, there was the Danish cartoons, the Charlie Hebdo attacks. US government messaging on those issues went as follows. We deplore these acts. We deplore violence. We deplore disrespect to religion. But you know what's coming, right? We uphold, can you tell me? Free speech. The right of that individual to take a match and set a pile of Qurans ablaze. Now, to the broad swath of audiences out there, that's a sentiment that they would agree with. But to certain audiences, and I would argue some of the most critical audiences out there, i.e. the ones who might resort to violence to defend their religious principles, that doesn't sound like freedom of speech, does it? What does it sound like? It sounds like support for desecration of Islam. And so there you have it. There is going to be a fundamental conflict in this case between the projection of a deeply held value and outlook in the United States and among certain audiences, a very different way of interpreting it. So we are never going to get away from the potential for there to be that conflict or that disagreement. What do you do about it? Well, first you acknowledge it. But secondly, and more importantly, I think there has to be a certain degree of expectations management internally. That just because you are taking these approaches, just because you are putting out these messages, because these approaches and messages are ultimately associated with a particular set of values, not all of them are going to have the same impact. You need to be aware of that. And this is where cultural diplomacy can come in, and education exchanges. Over the long term, exposing people to different value systems, exposing, providing opportunities for people to educate themselves, to get training, that's probably the most effective way to ultimately, at least to get shared understanding, if not agreement with the values. And so that's the role that cultural diplomacy can play.
Thank you, Vivian. So what I'm hearing is that public diplomacy and cultural diplomacy is not a crowd pleaser, and it's not a way to give audiences what they want to hear exactly. And I mean, I think
there are crowd pleaser elements. You know, I
can have fun in the process,
I look at
though.
Ukrainian Institute products, and I see a lot of crowd pleasing going on. So, and there is absolutely no harm in crowd pleasing. But we are talking about slightly more philosophical questions here. Yeah.
It's a provocation anyway. I think it would be fair to yeah, okay, great. We have a question. Yeah, thanks.
Доброго дня, мене звуть Микола Воробей.
Good day, my name is Mykola Vorobey. I am an interpreter and guide, and we've had mentioned a lot of opportunities to get Crimea back to Ukraine. And I think that there is a lot of opportunity that Ukraine has lost Crimea because we have never had this cultural diplomacy organizing Ukrainian language schools, organizing Ukrainian language libraries, or providing this kind of different diplomatic events, studying the history of Ukraine in Crimea, studying the history of Crimean Tatars in Ukraine. If we have never been doing that, then this niche has been covered by the Russians. And so basically they had this opportunity to process Crimeans in that way. So this is just as an add-on to Crimea, but that's, maybe you'll have some questions to our speakers connected to that from what you have said. What I wanted to say, whether do you believe it is real for us to get Crimea back when Russia has already done everything that is possible, what has been possible to do that? Iryna, I think you might start and saying that on behalf of everyone.
The Vivian heard the question, but the question was how real is that to deoccupy Crimea and to actually that Crimea could become or could return to Ukraine and to be part of Ukraine again. You know, if you ever heard our president or our minister of foreign affairs, you may probably heard that this is not only possible, but this is the only solution, and that this is absolutely the let's say result, which is. Not only possible, but the only result that could be sustainable, not only for Ukraine, but for the international global or international order. The Crimea is a part of Ukraine, and you remember the Crimea platform slogan, strong, yes, Crimea is Ukraine, stronger together. So Crimea is Ukraine, and it's the time of, or the matter of time when Crimea actually returned to Ukraine and be part of Ukraine again. This is not just the words or political slogans. Under these slogans are actions, practical one. So the Crimea platform has been launched. The process of the occupation has been launched. Now at the state level, there is going or the agenda on how, on the practical steps of on what the state should do in order to actually to achieve this goal. This track is on. The international track on the occupation is working. I mean, there are a lot of obstacles and there are a lot of tasks to do, but this is the only solution for us. And any other solution is acceptable for us. So, Vivian, can you refer to it or you pass it?
No, I think I leave that to
Okay.
Ігор Шабан, українська Ihor Shaban, Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. So first of all, for this wonderful panel, and thank you for this wonderful discussion. So I have a question to Ms. Iryna. You mentioned these events, the last year events, the ministry's actions, and I'm so interested in the following. Is something done beyond Ukraine? Because we have the Cultural Diplomacy Forum. What specific actions did ministry take in like Berlin, Washington, in other locations for us to popularize Ukraine, promote Ukraine, not only in a specifically political context, but in other, let's say, areas or segments as well, like the cinematography or even religious context, religious contacts. And it's interesting for me, do you have it in your plans? Do you plan to do something for the following months to launch something? Because you mentioned that the Ministry of Culture and Information Policy gives proposals, but what proposals are there? Please, if you may reveal it, if it's not confidential. And Ms. Vivian, thank you for being that into public diplomacy, not the scholarship in hip-hop, but also helping the country to helping the country with the security.
We have the support, for financial support coming from the state budget to the project that our embassies abroad could implement in order to spread the positive image of Ukraine. This program has been working since 2017. So every year we have the number of projects abroad all over the world, and I remind you that we have more than 100 diplomatic representations, so in more than 100 countries. So we have the very we have this unique opportunity through our embassy represent Ukraine every year with funded with the state money. We are forming every year. We are forming the plan of such projects. Our focus actually is the public diplomacy focus is the cultural diplomacy, economic diplomacy, expert diplomacy. Now we are developing the two new tracks, is gastro and wine diplomacy, which are very promising for us, as they are kind of very popular soft power that people really like, and this is about positive narrativization as well, bringing our culture through food and wine to the foreign audience. So the last year, I think we implemented, even considering the COVID pandemic situation and the downsizing of the budget money, we have implemented more than 40 projects abroad. But let's remember that the last year was actually the disaster for project management and event management. This year we planned, I think, around 100 or a little bit more projects abroad, including digital one, because pandemic actually has dictated us this need to prioritize the digital projects. So this track is going on, and I think that together with Ukrainian Institute, this representation of the project is really, let's say, enormous. And what can I say more? If you actually read our strategy for public diplomacy, you can see that we have 7 direction or seven direction for the public diplomacy. We actually take them in mind when we are planning our events abroad. We are keeping in mind our goals, three main goals: that Ukraine is more known, that we are a European country, and positive narrativization. So this is actually our ground for the decision then which project is actually getting money and which project unfortunately is not of a priority for us. And of course our embassies are very active, and every year we have the situation that we have eliminated a lot of good projects because we don't have enough money for them. But I think that actually every not only MFA, but the Ukrainian Institute and every cultural institution that is working with the projects abroad, so actually facing the same problem, and so that's it.
Thanks, Ira. I mean, I just can add to that question briefly that the Ukrainian Institute has been doing quite a lot of cultural diplomacy projects over the past 3 years, and just this month we're having, we just had a great festival of Ukrainian academic music in Warsaw. This month, Ukrainian musicians performed at the Istanbul Music Festival for the first time, and over the coming months, we're planning a theatrical and music performance dedicated to the tragedy of Babyn Yar in Berlin and in London, and also a performance of a documentary play about the prisoners of conscience in Crimea, about civil journalists who are currently imprisoned by the occupational regime, and it's going to be produced in many more places internationally next year. So we're doing as much as we can under the current COVID circumstances to not just to maintain digital presence internationally, but also to have that very important people-to-people contacts in many countries, in many places. Right, we have one more question, yeah?
So, good afternoon, dear ladies and gentlemen of the participants of the forum. I am the art expert, and I do have a lot of expertise when it comes to the art object protection. I used to be one of the state officials. I was doing that professionally. I was preparing the candidates' profiles. The candidacy profiles for the World Heritage objects from Ukraine, and right now I work with young people. And Miss Vivian Walker mentioned about the importance of cultural diplomacy when it comes to popularization of cultural heritage and protection of relevant objects. So, Miss Iryna Borovets, you mentioned the Crimean platform and also other forums and platforms of international cooperation. But for example, Crimea, it has a huge potential when it comes to cultural heritage, recreational areas and parks and natural parks and reserves. And Ukraine, and this context is quite a multidisciplinary, it's a multicultural country, and we do have potential, we do have this capacity. And therefore, question: do you have in your plans, do you have this in your plans to establish this international creative youth platform where it would be possible to teach Ukrainian students, talented youth, on how to cooperate internationally? Because I have this expertise. I've spent so many years with students in the area of design and visual art. Again, I'm an art expert. And I do think that young people, that youth is the most productive narrative. It can perform the cultural diplomacy tasks the most successfully at international level. So if you still don't have these plans in your agendas, maybe this issue can somehow be incorporated for the 2022, because we do have so many truly interesting projects. We have so many young people fully fluent in foreign languages, and it truly is the potential that may present Ukraine at international level with the best results. Thank you.
This was question actually mostly for me as the representative of the MFA. At the moment, we don't have any particular program that that deals with the youth, or any international platform or youth platform for public or cultural diplomacy. But at the moment, we are at the MFA. We are thinking of the ways how attract young people to our project, for sure. First of all, because the digital diplomacy is one of the 7 pillar of the public diplomacy, which is going to develop, and we already have launched, maybe you know, the website Ukraine UA, a digital format. Basically, this is the website about attractions of Ukraine, which is suitable for foreigners in order to familiarize themselves with what is Ukraine, with touristic opportunities here, with attractive places to visit, or with cultural events that are going on in Ukraine. So actually you can follow it on the website. We have launched the respective pages in social networks. There is a Facebook page, an Instagram page of Ukraine UA, and basically actually this format is not created purely for young people, but this format actually is most suitable for them, because of course young people are in the internet non-stop, and they learn any new information basically purely from the internet. So we understanding that, we have launched those projects, and maybe there is a space, as you said, to think over, or to think about how we can engage young people more into the public diplomacy.
Thank you. We're actually out of time, but we can take one more very quick question and a 1-minute answer to that question, if possible.
Вітаю, мене звати Яніна Борибіна.
My name is Iryna Borybina. I came to this wonderful forum from Poltava, and I'm the co-founder of international festival Poltavska Galushka. So I have a question, Miss Iryna, please, question to you. The practical component, as a representative of such a huge cultural event in Poltava region and in Ukraine, so in which practical way we as a team, for example, can be involved to the projects launched by you, and how we can be presented in this international cultural environment? And I'll ask you, as an MP of Poltava City Council, how can I personally help our local cultural environment to be incorporated to those projects that you do implement, and for Poltava region with its wonderful culture to be fully presented at those websites you mentioned about, and in all your projects where we can be involved? Thank you.
Okay, so very short answer. This is very easy. You can actually address your project proposals directly to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Department of Communication and Public Diplomacy. And that's it. That would be the first step, but this is necessary to present what you can and what you are able to do. And so that's it.
Thank you very much, Vivian, Iryna, for the meaningful discussion and for the precious messages that you've said today that I think, together with what has been said at the first two sessions, can indeed form a very comprehensive terms of reference for Ukraine's public and cultural diplomacy.